Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of The Space Between. My name is Zach Eichels, and I'll be your host for today. Today, we're joined by
Adrian Santiago Tate from HighTide Intelligence.
Thank you so much for joining us, Adrian. We really appreciate your time.
Absolutely.
So today's topic will be about flooding and flood insurance and whatnot. So with that, we'll go into the questions. What inspired you to start HighTide, and how is your work addressing the challenges of flooding in coastal communities like Cape Canaveral? What is HighTide all about?
So HighTide is all about empowering communities and individuals with data so that they understand their flood risk and are better prepared to manage it and can take action to manage it proactively.
Okay.
And the origin is that I grew up in the Netherlands, which is below sea level.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I have family in Florida.
Okay.
So,
both areas have flood challenges.
yes. And the Netherlands has hundreds of years of history of kind of being leaders in the world of managing their flood risk. And Florida has a lot of work to do to get to that point, right, over the coming decades as we deal with higher flood risk. So it was all about taking kind of this original inspiration of seeing how the Dutch have done it and then bringing that to Florida and the rest of the world.
Okay. So what was the purpose of the report that HighTide actually just completed for the City of Cape Canaveral, and what were some of the key findings?
So right now the city is doing its vulnerability assessment to assess sea level rise and storm surge risks. And that is mostly focused on publicly owned assets, the so-called critical assets, right?
Sure.
So like utilities, roadways, wastewater treatment facility. And what we did to add to this is that we also looked at the privately owned, the buildings,
Right.
to see how flooding could impact the residents of the city. So we were kind of complementing this study with additional analysis to look at other factors.
Okay. So the vulnerability assessment is more like public infrastructure, whereas yours was more of a private and commercial infrastructure.
Exactly.
Okay.
So that we cover all bases.
Nice. How is the increasing risk of flooding impacting Florida's Space Coast specifically, and what's driving this trend?
Okay, so I think the main place where we're seeing an impact, other than obviously if you're being flooded,
Sure.
kind of in a general sense, is that flood insurance is going to get more expensive, right? So for some people that already have a policy, they're going to see that policy increase. It's going to get more expensive. And for those that don't have a policy, that don't have a mandatory flood insurance requirement, they might be added to a flood zone next time the maps get updated. So we saw that in South Florida and Broward County. Tens of thousands of properties that were not in the floodplain are now required to carry flood insurance. So we're going to see higher prices of flood insurance, more people required to buy flood insurance. And so that's the first place where you're seeing an impact, financial impact. But then, like we saw with Nicole, there was quite a lot of erosion along the Space Coast, right? So properties that are right on the Atlantic coast will probably have to deal with that. And just more flooding in general. Although it's, flood risk goes up doesn't mean it's going to flood tomorrow.
Sure.
But it could flood in 5 or 10 years. So it's
The likelihood
goes up
more often. And to that end, can you discuss more about FEMA's flood maps? And I think sometimes a perception that, I'm not in an official flood zone, I'm okay and whatnot. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, that's really important to understand, because for a long time we've lived in this paradigm where you're either in a flood zone or you're out of a flood zone. Those that are inside of flood zone are aware that they have to buy flood insurance, and many of them carry flood insurance. But then if you're outside of flood zone, it's almost like flooding doesn't exist. And that's not the case.
Right.
We're seeing, Asheville is a great example of a place that, I have family in Asheville. I never imagined that there would be a big flood in Asheville that would devastate that city, but that's what just happened.
Right.
So, we're going to see more frequent extreme events that are going to catch communities off guard, which means just because you're not in a flood zone, it doesn't mean you don't have flood risk. And the good thing about not being in a flood zone is your policies are actually going to be extremely affordable, like a few $100s a year. So you could carry this huge financial loss. Like you could protect yourself from this huge potential loss at a very low cost.
Can you speak to also, because the flood maps are often denoted by the 100 and 500 year floodplains. And, if you're in a so-called 500-year floodplain, there might be this misconception that you don't have much of a risk, or that it's every 500 years, and that's not really how that works.
Right.
So same with the 100 years. So can you speak to that?
Definitely. And this starts getting into kind of the weeds, but basically this whole idea of a 100-year flood is not that it's going to happen once in 100 years. It's more that there's a 1 in 100 probability every single year.
So it's a chance.
Right.
Percentage.
Exactly. Yeah. So you're rolling the dice and there's a 1 in 100 chance that it'll flood. But what is that number based on? That number is based on data, on records that are not 100 years old.
Right.
In most places, we don't have 100 years of data. And we definitely don't have 500 years of data anywhere. So whenever they're coming up with these numbers, it's really just the best number you can come up with the available data, which is often, also quite outdated. Like these flood maps are updated every 5, 10 or so years. So the flood maps you have now, maybe based on data, does not account for all these extreme events we're seeing. So really, if you're in a 500-year floodplain, it's almost like you were in a 100-year floodplain 10 years ago. And I'm making these numbers up, but everybody is.
Right. So Arkly is one of HighTide's signature tools. Can you tell us how it works and how it helps homeowners and communities?
Absolutely. So part of our contribution to the study is not just this report, but also that Arkly is live in the city. And Arkly it's all about helping you understand what your risk means to you in dollars. And then what are your alternatives, right? How can you manage that risk? And when it comes to something like flooding, there's really very few options that you have as a homeowner. So you could basically do nothing and assume the risk, which is what a lot of people do. You could buy flood insurance and basically pay someone else to take that risk from you. Or you could make an investment in elevating your home or flood-proofing it so that it doesn't get damaged.
Right.
And then the last option is to sell your home and move somewhere else, which is not really what we're going.
Not optimal. Yeah.
Right. Exactly.
Okay.
So we just so Arkly is all about equipping people to make that decision so they can manage their flood risk and keep living in the place they love.
Very cool. And that tool is live on the city's website now for people to use. So yeah, that's very good. What role does flood insurance play in managing risk for property owners? And how does flood insurance differ from homeowners insurance?
So flood insurance is like your first line of defense, right? And the thing that a lot of people don't understand is that homeowners insurance does not cover flooding. So homeowners covers pretty much everything you can think of. It covers liability, it covers theft, it covers fire. It does not cover flooding. And that's because flooding has historically been very challenging to insure. So it's a separate policy.
Okay. Cape Canaveral has a Class 8 rating right now in the community rating system. How does this benefit our residents, and how can cities like ours improve their ratings further? And to that end, can you just kind of tell our viewers what the community rating system actually is?
Absolutely. So the community rating system is a floodplain management program under FEMA, under the National Flood Insurance Program. So basically, it allows communities the ability to do floodplain management activities and then be rewarded for that in terms of flood insurance discounts.
Okay.
So anyone in the City of Cape Canaveral who has a policy under the National Flood Insurance Program will receive a discount because the city is a Class 8.
Okay. That's 10% in our case.
And that's 10%. Every class is an additional 5% discount.
Nice. How does you kind of touched on this earlier, but how does the state mandated vulnerability assessment support Cape Canaveral's long-term resilience planning? And what is HighTide's role in the process of the vulnerability assessment?
So the purpose of the Resilient Florida program, which administers the vulnerability assessments, is to basically identify the risks, so critical assets, and then once you've done the vulnerability assessments, you can then apply for funding to address those risks.
Okay.
Right. So for example, the city of Satellite Beach did their vulnerability assessments. They identified that their fire station was in a flood zone, very at risk, and they're building a new one.
Okay.
So it's those kinds of projects will be unlocked by the vulnerability assessment.
Okay. And why did do you know why the state mandated that, or what's the deal with that?
I guess just to start investing and making sure that the whole state is ready for, what the future brings.
Okay. What steps can private property owners take to reduce flood risk, and how does Arkly help them make informed decisions?
So in terms of reducing flood risk or mitigating flood risk, there's only so much you can do. So the most standard thing is to elevate your home, which is a very expensive project, but then you're addressing your flood risk for several decades. If you want to make a smaller investment but still mitigate your flood risk, you could do some flood proofing, but that's typically reserved for commercial properties. So you're kind of in the realm of DIY flood proofing at that point. So the lower cost solutions do exist, but it's very hard to address flooding without making a large investment.
Sure.
Basically.
Sure. Where can people go to learn more about their flood risk and find tools to take action, like those offered by HighTide?
Well, FEMA is kind of the main resource that's out there for you, like official resource. And then there's going to be websites like Arkly. So kind of going back to the previous question, Arkly can help you understand how much an elevation project could cost, right? So here's what your risk is. Here's what the project can cost. Is it worth it to you, right? as far as other resources, there's not a whole lot. That's kind of why we made the tool.
Yeah. Okay. That's good. I'm glad you made it. And then finally, what do you see as the biggest challenges and opportunities in adapting to sea level rise over the next few decades?
There's kind of, there's all the technical and data problems that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. They're relatively easy compared to the real challenges. Like the real challenges are, one is human psychology. People don't typically make proactive decisions. The vast majority of people don't. We're all very reactive as a species. So it's kind of just helping people understand how important it is to get ahead of this problem. In some places, it's an existential thing for communities to get ahead of sea level rise. And then the other challenge is just the funding. It's a very expensive problem, which means it's going to take a lot of capital to overcome it.
Right.
Those are really the two main challenges.
Right.
Big picture.
So bouncing off the last question, and in trying to combat these challenges of flooding and sea level rise, where do you see the state of Florida currently in what it's doing to help mitigate these issues?
So, the state of Florida has shown leadership by creating the Resilient Florida program and providing funding for communities to do the vulnerability assessments that we were talking about. And they recently announced a new program called Elevate Florida, which will provide funding for investments in private properties. So not just the publicly owned assets, but also will provide funding for flood mitigation to, for example, elevate buildings owned by people in high-risk areas. So awesome. That's pretty awesome. We haven't seen that. That's usually at the federal level, this federal grants.
Right.
But this is a state program.
Right.
So that's pretty exciting.
And the Resilient Florida program is something that the city is actually taking advantage of with at least two projects, the updating our vulnerability assessment, which we're doing now, and then the Center Street pump station was partially paid for by Resilient Florida grant funding.
Right.
So that's been very helpful. We appreciate it.
That's awesome.
Well, thank you, Adrian. We really appreciate your time. That was awesome. And thank you, everybody, for watching. We'll see you next time on another episode of The Space Between.
Thank you, Zach.